My name is Anna, and I'm 32 years old, a working housewife living with my husband and son. I joined my current company right after graduating, and this year marks my 10th anniversary with them. I took maternity leave when my son was born, returning to work when he turned one, and I've been actively working in sales ever since. Recently, my hard work has been paying off, and I'm on the brink of a promotion, which makes work even more enjoyable for me. However, my husband, who is 3 years younger, is the opposite. He has been changing jobs frequently, believing it's essential for his future entrepreneurial pursuits. Despite this, his salary has been decreasing with each job change. Initially, things went well between us during our first 2 years of marriage, but my husband's unstable work situation made us financially insecure. He talked a lot about dreams of starting a business, building our own house, and traveling abroad, which I found enjoyable. But his demeanor changed after our son was born. While I was on maternity and childcare leave, everything seemed manageable. However, when I returned to work, life became overwhelmingly busy. I was responsible for preparing breakfast, dropping our child off at daycare, working full-time, picking up our child, stopping at the supermarket, and preparing dinner, all with little time to catch my breath. Despite my busy schedule, my husband ignored my efforts. He refused to help with daycare drop-offs or pickups, fearing what others might think of him having too much time on his hands. Despite my attempts to explain that modern fathers are involved in childcare, he remained adamant. I worked tirelessly, managing household chores, childcare, and work responsibilities, all for the sake of my family. Unfortunately, my husband's father was the only one who understood and supported me, but he was working far away. My mother-in-law, a traditional housewife, didn't appreciate my decision to continue working after giving birth and sided with her son. It was clear she felt frustrated by my professional success compared to her son's frequent job changes and lack of success. This situation left me feeling unsupported and misunderstood within my own family. Every time I encountered my mother-in-law, she would make cutting remarks, suggesting that I should prioritize my roles as a wife and mother over my career. It seemed she couldn't comprehend that we couldn't sustain our lifestyle solely on my husband's income. As time went on, her comments became more pointed, implying it was unfortunate to leave our child in daycare so late or suggesting I should quit my job altogether. Perhaps due to my father-in-law's prolonged absence for work, my mother-in-law had ample free time. She would casually drop by our house, make her critical remarks, and then leave. Dealing with her constant blame was mentally taxing, and I had nearly resigned myself to not being understood by people with old-fashioned perspectives like hers. However, it turned out that my husband was also affected by my success at work. When I shared news of my accomplishments and pay raise, his response was lackluster, barely acknowledging my achievements. Instead, he began making remarks like, "Don't get too full of yourself just because you earn a bit more than me. What's the point of my daily grind?" Enduring the combined criticism from both my husband and mother-in-law became unbearable, and I started to regret my marriage. To make matters worse, my husband started arriving home later and later, sometimes well past midnight, despite working at a factory with standard business hours. When I questioned him about these late nights, he would simply claim he was working and become defensive when pressed for details, shutting down any further discussion. Then came the incident that I had missed noticing. One evening, my mother-in-law unexpectedly showed up at our house, as she often did unannounced. However, that day was particularly difficult for me. I had stayed up late preparing a lunchbox for my son's sports day at daycare, feeling exhausted and wanting an early rest, especially with an important business negotiation scheduled for the next day. My son, worn out from the sports day, had already fallen asleep in his room by the time my mother-in-law arrived. As my exhausted body moved towards the kitchen to serve tea to my unexpected guest, my husband suddenly grabbed my arm tightly, surprising me. He insisted that he would take care of it, a rare offer considering he seldom cooked or helped around the house, especially when I was tired. I assumed he was merely trying to impress his mother with this uncharacteristic gesture and attempted to brush it off. but he wouldn't release my arm. Forcefully, he directed me to sit on the sofa, raising his voice to emphasize that I needed to rest. I was perplexed by his abrupt actions. If my husband served the tea, I knew my mother-in-law would criticize me for not fulfilling my role as a hostess. To my surprise, my mother-in-law intervened, urging me to sit down while she smiled kindly. As they exchanged these unexpected pleasantries, my husband began preparing the tea in the kitchen. Their behavior was so out of character that I couldn't help but feel something was amiss. When my husband returned with the tea, smiling warmly, I observed him closely. It seemed like he kept glancing at me, and my mother-in-law appeared unusually fidgety. I sensed there was more to this situation than met the eye. As I reached for the teacup, I realized my husband was up to something. Their sudden change in demeanor was too orchestrated to be genuine. Determined not to play along with their scheme, I decided to take charge. I casually mentioned that we might have some tea sweets in the fridge that my mother-in-law would enjoy. Normally, my husband wouldn't bother with tea sweets for guests, but today was different. He seemed momentarily puzzled but quickly headed back to the kitchen at my suggestion. My mother-in-law, echoing my sentiments, expressed concern about the inconvenience they were causing. They both retreated to the kitchen, seizing the opportunity I had created. When my husband returned, I finally lifted the teacup to my lips. As we engaged in idle conversation, sharing videos of the day's sports festival, I noticed my husband and mother-in-law observing me with unnatural interest. Despite the unsettling gazes directed at me, I calmly finished my tea, all the while noticing my husband's bewildered expression. I expected that time would pass without incident, but as anticipated, something unusual occurred. Suddenly, my mother-in-law, who had been chatting cheerfully moments before, grew pale and began to frown. Abruptly standing, she clutched her stomach and rushed out of the living room towards the bathroom. I couldn't help but smirk. I had suspected as much. Glancing at my husband, I noticed his shock and wide eyes. After giving me a brief glare, he hurriedly followed my mother-in-law, banging on the bathroom door and calling out anxiously. Meanwhile, I could hear my mother-in-law moaning in pain from inside the bathroom, though her words were indistinct. However, I had a strong inkling of what was happening. After a few tense minutes, my husband returned to the living room, leaving my mother-in-law still in the bathroom. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. Seizing the moment, I calmly addressed him. "It seems the tea you prepared had quite a dangerous ingredient, doesn't it? So, it's really your fault after all." His eyes widened in shock as he retorted, "You suspected me? You're the worst wife." Amused by his absurd accusation, I replied, "You're the one who initiated this whole thing. The tea you brewed for me was so suspicious that I simply swapped it with your mother's cup." He spat back, "You're the worst." I couldn't contain my laughter at his feeble argument. I had sensed something was awry when I noticed a strange powder residue in the teacup he served. Upon closer inspection, it confirmed my suspicions. If you were someone who regularly made tea, I wouldn't have suspected a thing. But you don't usually handle household chores, and your mother seems to believe wives should do everything. I couldn't fathom that they had conspired to actually give me a break. That's why I meticulously observed my husband's actions and the tea he served. After my husband confessed, it turned out his motive was incredibly trivial. Aware of my important business negotiation the next day, he and my mother-in-law had schemed to sabotage my work. Had their plan succeeded, I might have been forced to cancel the negotiation due to illness or endure embarrassing consequences during the meeting. It was a despicable act, jeopardizing my reputation at the company. Even so, putting foreign substances in someone's drink was undeniably criminal. It's bewildering why my husband and mother-in-law went to such lengths against me, but it's simply pathetic. My husband confessed everything and then threatened to claim damages from me if anything happened to his mother. Huh? What are you talking about? You're the one who should pay the damages, don't you think so? I retorted with a snort. I had suspected my husband of having an affair for some time. Despite claiming to work late or being busy even on his days off, he showed little interest in our family and spent most of his time on his smartphone. So I hired an investigator, and as I expected, he was indeed having an affair. He had met a young woman at a matchmaking event, lied about starting his own company, and began dating her. The woman, fresh out of school and naive, fell for his lies. Later, my husband justified his actions by claiming he needed to regain his confidence by dating a younger woman, likely boasting about his future CEO status. Seeing my husband freeze and turn pale when I confronted him about his affair, I decided it was time for a divorce. "Let's get a divorce. You'll have to pay child support," I told him, and he reluctantly agreed. Then he had the audacity to demand half of my secret savings after the divorce. "Why do I have to hand over my assets to you?" I asked incredulously. "Money saved before marriage is not subject to property division. Most of that savings is from when I was single," I explained. Upon hearing this, my husband was disappointed. I then made it clear that he couldn't take any furniture or appliances from our home, all purchased with my money, and the house was rented in my name. As my mother-in-law emerged from the bathroom, I informed her that I would be reporting the incident to my father-in-law. She pleaded with me to keep it a secret from her son, but I ignored her and contacted my father-in-law immediately. He was furious and demanded a divorce from my mother-in-law. Meanwhile, my husband finally realized the gravity of his situation upon learning he wouldn't receive any property division. He pleaded with me, kneeling and crying, but it was too late to change my mind. I hired a lawyer and successfully divorced him, ensuring I received child support. Due to his low income, he ended up with a substantial debt. Moreover, both he and my mother-in-law were convicted of assault for the laxative incident and received suspended sentences, tarnishing their records. His mistress also lost affection for him, and now he works tirelessly to pay off debts, leading a miserable life. My mother-in-law, abandoned by my father-in-law, faced the consequences of her actions. Despite the challenges, I was promoted to leader of the sales team thanks to a successful negotiation. I moved out with my son and now live happily in a new apartment. Although my first marriage ended in failure, I am determined to balance work and parenting and seize happiness from now on.